Good evening. Thank you for joining the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Reading Room. You're at Social Justice at Asala, which is a webinar series dedicated to the history of African American studies and focused on outreach to the community. Please introduce yourself in the chat as you have. I see folks are here from all over the country. You're saying your universities. If you're with an ASALA chapter, go ahead and enter the chapter in there as well. And just know that we're always looking for new members. You don't have to be a historian. As we say, our outreach in this case is specifically to the community. And with your membership, we can continue this free reading room and social justice webinar series. You can learn more about social justice at ASALA by going to the ASALA website, which is ASALA, ASALH.org. Tonight's reading room is titled The Power of Truth Telling in History, and we'll be joined by Gwen Ifill. We'll be joined by Sherilyn Ifill. Please excuse me. All our offerings are recorded, and so later you can go on asala.org and see this and all of the other webinar and reading rooms. Again, introduce yourself, use the chat. After a dialogue between our panelists, we will take questions and answers. So I ask that you use the Q&A button and type your questions in, and we'll have folks looking over the questions and then presenting them to our panelists tonight. And so thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Dr. Marvin Dulaney.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. As you heard, I am Marvin Dulaney, president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I am a 50-year member of ASALA. ASALA is the oldest organization in the country that studies and promotes and preserves African American life and history. We published the Journal of Negro History. Excuse me, we published the Journal of African American History. We published the Black History Bulletin. In addition, we are the founders of Black History Month. We have been doing these social justice reading rooms with Howard University. We are very proud to partner with Howard to do these reading rooms since last year. And they've been very extraordinary, very informative. This evening, I want to introduce you to our former president, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who is a PhD and scholar at Harvard University, and she will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Evelyn.
Well, thank you, Marvin, President Dulaney, and thank you, Michelle Peugeot, for this program this evening. And it is really my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the ASALA Social Justice Reading Room. I am Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and your guide into this virtual space for exploring important books and articles on social justice. ASALA is proud to host its reading room and this program tonight in collaboration with Howard University's Social Justice Consortium under the leadership of History Department Chair, Dr. Nikki Taylor. And this program, along with the entire project, is funded by the Just Futures grant of the Mellon Foundation. ASALA has designed its reading room to be an inviting space for people from all walks of life, not just academics. Our goal is to introduce you to authors whose publications in the form of books, as well as articles, speak in compelling ways to the continuing struggle for racial equality in America. And we are especially honored this evening to hear from Sherilyn Ifill. Please come on, Sherilyn. She is one of the greatest civil rights lawyers of our day. And she and I will be talking about her book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century. Most of us associate Sherrilyn Ifill, and by the way, Michelle, she's Gwen Ifill's cousin, but most of us associate Sherrilyn Ifill with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. LDF, as this great organization is called, this civil rights organization that was initially led by Thurgood Marshall, has continued over the decades to fight valiantly in the courts for racial justice in America. And until the early months of 2022, Sherrilyn Ifill led the LDF as its president and director counsel, having served in this role for 10 years before stepping down. She led the LDF with strategic vision and commitment to groundbreaking litigation in the areas of voting rights, education, economic, and social justice. Under her leadership, the LDF played a prominent role in confronting police violence against unarmed persons. She currently serves as a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. Sherrilyn Ifill is the recipient of many honorary degrees. She was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Earlier this year, she was honored for her civil rights advocacy and legal work by Harvard University, which bestowed upon her the Radcliffe Medal. And likewise, she was the recipient in 2022 of the American Bar Association's Thurgood Marshall Award. But her life and career have been impactful also in the role of professor and scholar. Prior to her leadership of LDF, Sherrilyn Ifill taught on the faculty of the University of Maryland School of Law in Baltimore. She taught civil procedure and constitutional law to thousands of law students, and she pioneered a series of law clinics, including one of the earliest law clinics in the country to focus on challenging legal barriers to the re-entry of formerly incarcerated men and women. She is a prolific scholar who has published articles in law journals. She's written op-eds and commentaries in leading newspapers. So tonight we are in the unique position of hearing Sherrilyn Ifill talk about her book. And this book is focused on one of this nation's most shameful and violent historical realities. And of course, I'm talking about lynching. Her book, titled On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, was first published in 2008. And in 2018, the 10th anniversary edition of On the Courthouse Lawn was published. The book continues to challenge us, and Sherrilyn Ifill continues to inspire us to confront the past with the power of truth telling. And in fact, in 2022, this theme in her book calls out to us more urgently than ever. So let me begin this conversation with you, Sherrilyn Ifill, by referencing the great lawyer, Bryan Stevenson, who gave, for the audience, you should know, an absolutely unforgettable speech at the ASALH conference this past September. Some of you were there. Bryan Stevenson wrote the foreword to the 10th anniversary edition of Sherrilyn Ifill's book, and he called the book a must read. I'd like to share his words with our audience. Bryan Stevenson writes, and I quote him, "For people who seek racial equality, who want an America where justice for all is not an empty slogan, there is critically important work to do. Preparing for that work will require an education that starts with understanding our past and recognizing the burden created by our bigoted history of racial inequality. Some essential reading is necessary to truly achieve the progress our nation desperately needs. And there is no more skilled teacher than Sherrilyn Ifill, or better place to begin this education than on the courthouse lawn. Those are powerful words. So thinking about your book in terms of this kind of necessary education, share with us why you wrote the book in the first place. You know, when you did, what motivated you at that time to take up the research on lynching?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me tonight. I so appreciate it. It is an honor to be with you, Dr. Higginbotham, and with the association. And I did try to fill out my membership form before we got started, but it asked a lot, so I didn't get to finish. But I will finish when the program is done. And I'm really grateful to all who have joined. I see people that I know, Ryan Napoli, my former student. I saw Al Yasha from Atlanta. It's just wonderful. I see people from Ireland and all over the place, and that's beautiful. And I'm so glad that you were willing to take time out of your night to be part of this conversation. And I appreciate the question very much, because in many ways, my motivation to write the book comes out of what I think is part of what intrigues me and what I love about the work to which I've committed my life, which is just doing civil rights work and civil rights lawyering, which is a kind of endless curiosity, you know, as you try to unpack this thing, sometimes this poison in American public life, but also a source of my own identity and pride, a source of community. And as I try to understand the phenomenon of white supremacy and what it has meant for the communities I've chosen to represent and what it's meant for this country. And, you know, for me, the connections are always being made. I mean, I feel like there's a lens over my eyes that makes me see things in a very particular way. And very often I find that where I wind up knits together with experiences that I've had or that I've heard about in my work. And this was one of them. I wrote the book because I was faced with just something that had happened to me over and over again, which is that when I would engage with a community that I represented in a civil rights case, which I did for 5 years as a young lawyer at the LDF, I was a voting rights attorney. And as I was sharing with you before we started, my first clients were in Texas and Houston. So to be an LDF lawyer means that you're traveling through the South and you're meeting your clients in the communities where they live. And so that very first year, you know, I was traveling through the Arkansas Delta, I was traveling in Texas and Alabama. And part of being a voting rights lawyer requires you to learn something about the history of the community that you're representing. And in fact, it's an explicit part of the showing you have to make if you're bringing claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The history of discrimination and race in that community is an actual part of the showing that the plaintiffs have to make if they are going to challenge an election practice under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So you're constantly asking about the history. You're, of course, doing your own research, but as we all know, there's only so much that's in the books. So you always ask your clients, you know, tell us a little bit about what you know about, you know, the racial history of this community. And it would happen over and over again that as part of that racial history, there would be some incident of racial terrorism, some pogrom, sometimes a lynching, often a lynching, but some racial violence. It may have happened long before the person I was talking to was alive, but it was so powerful and so resonant for them. I learned about the Tulsa race massacre, for example, in 1991, when I was representing clients in Tulsa and Oklahoma counties in a voting rights case challenging the way judges were elected. And in Tulsa, the clients told me about this thing that happened in the 1920s, which I'd never heard of before and which I'd never seen, even documented anywhere. So there was this kind of oral history, you know, and what was, you know, kind of moving for me was no matter what kind of claim I was bringing, this story about racial violence was always there. And so when I was then teaching at Maryland and starting these new clinics, one of the ones that I developed was an environmental justice clinic. And I was representing folks out on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in a Black community where the state had planned to run a highway directly next to the community. And this was the third time the community had been affected by a transportation decision of this sort. But in the middle of working on that, I became a fellow with the Rockefeller Foundation, and there was a cohort of 25 of us. And one of the things we did was go to South Africa. And this was during the process when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was getting on its feet. So I'm in South Africa, and there's this phenomenon where obviously Black people are talking about the violence of the apartheid regime. I had worked for a lobbying organization that lobbied against the apartheid regime. I had been a legal intern with Judge Higginbotham, who had really, and his scholarship and experience and work had exposed me deeply to what was happening in South Africa. And then I had this job, had this job earlier in college, working for this lobbying firm. So that was kind of my thing. I was very into the anti-apartheid movement and working for the anti-apartheid movement here in the United States. So I go to South Africa, and they're beginning to stand up the commission, and people are beginning to tell their stories. And the phenomenon I found in South Africa was precisely the same phenomenon I was finding on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is that Black people had very specific, detailed memories. And I use air quotes for memories because often they were memories even if the person wasn't there. But they had these memories of racial violence, of lynchings that happened in the case of the Eastern Shore, 2 lynchings that had happened in the 1930s. But in the white community, they professed kind of ignorance. I mean, I would talk to white people, even white people who were aligned with our lawsuit on the Eastern Shore, and they would say, "Oh, I think that happened before I was, born." And I would say, "Well, no, how old do you know? No, you probably were in high school then, or they would say, "I think that was in another county. I think it was, 2 counties over." So here it was, Black people were having these incredibly vivid memories, and white people were professing this ignorance, which is precisely what was happening in South Africa when Black people were sharing the violence of apartheid during the Truth and Reconciliation process, and white people were saying, "We didn't know. We didn't know," even though we opened the paper every day and somehow people were jumping out of the window at John Foster Square, or we never asked our maids, what was happening in their lives. We never asked, we never noticed, even though we knew we were a minority of the population, but we had all the power and so forth. So it was the same dynamic of memories that were so powerful and so strong that even people who weren't there remembered them in the Black community.
Yeah,
And then in the white community, this kind of whitewash.
Yeah, I really want us to explore that more. I'm going to be asking you more about that because honestly, when we met in Alabama, we had a wonderful. It was our 107th conference, annual conference. We met in Alabama in September, and many of us, including myself, we visited the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is a memorial to the Black victims of lynching in the United States. And in fact, I visited with Michelle Peugeot, she and I, and her husband, and Lillian, we went there, and it is quite moving. It's also really disturbing to read the many, many names inscribed on the Lillian Williams, as I went with, and to see the many, many names inscribed on the many pillars that hang down from these structures, these pillars hanging from the ceiling. And I thought about that image when reading your book and this discussion. I just want you to say more about this, and then I will ask you about the white response. But my question to you is, it's about this Black collective memory and what you call the collective psyche, because Black people remember these stories. These may not even be people in our own families. The Emmett Till emphasis this year has been so powerful for capturing this. But there are many victims who are remembered in the Black community in a very personal and present sort of way. They're still, it's a present issue. And they aren't victims or names relegated to the past. Could you just say more about that? Because that whole psychological identification I find so important.
Yeah, there's an element to it that, if there's one shift that's happened in the last few years, I think excavating those memories and validating them in the public space is really important, which is why I wrote about the need to acknowledge lynching in our public spaces. There is a gaslighting, if you go, the name of the book is On the Courthouse Lawn, for the very simple reason that I wanted to break through the gaslighting. When I was growing up in New York, I believed that lynching was something that happened in the woods, in the backwoods. When I began studying lynching, actually, most of them that I studied happened on the courthouse lawn. Matthew Williams was lynched in 1931 on the corner of Main and Division. It doesn't get more downtown than that in Salisbury, Maryland. And that's important because it means that people knew. And so part of what I wanted to do was to break through and to ensure that the memories of Black people, were given kind of center stage. The same, you talked about Emmett Till. It's been estimated that 10,000 people walked past that casket. And they took that image back to their families. Think about how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, read the Jet magazine and then passed that on. And you know how we are, we do keep the old Jets. We used to keep the old Jets in our house for many, many years. And so we've had a way of sharing these stories. I talk about it in the book. I interviewed a Black man who was on the Wicomico County Council at the time that I interviewed him. And his daughter teaches at Coppin State in Baltimore. And he told me that he remembered the lynching and he would talk about it. And it wasn't until he got to high school that he realized that it had happened before he was born. He actually thought he'd seen it. That's how vividly he remembered the stories being told, because parents would talk about it, Black parents would talk about it. They'd send the kids out, but the kids would be on the stairs or under the stairs listening, to these stories. And he said it was so vivid and so powerful for him that he actually thought he was there. And what should really shock us is, remember, most Black people have not witnessed a lynching. When lynchings were getting ready to happen and the white mob was moving through the streets, Black people were trying to get home and behind closed doors. They were not standing around watching lynchings if they could avoid it, right? And yet we have these powerful and vivid memories, which gives you a sense of the weight of the terror and how deeply that terror affected our psyche and entered the psyche of our community. And it stood for certain things. It stood for the fact that lots of people can see this terrible thing happen and will say nothing, that it is not just, Klan members. I mean, people would ask me all the time, so was this the Klan? I found no evidence, actually, of the organized Klan in either of the two counties where these two lynchings occurred. These were ordinary people that housewives came out to watch, and law students, and the high school football team was having dinner across the street in the Wicomico Hotel after the big game. That's what terrified us. We understood that you might not see it coming. It's so random, it's so irrational, and that ordinary people will watch and they will not tell the truth about what happened. And so we have to really engage that reality. And a lot of how we engage with Black people in this country and engage with the phenomenon of white supremacy, which is only growing more blatant and back to the surface, is informed by that memory and that knowledge. And I think, therefore, when we began seeing these police videos of beating and killing unarmed Black people, that is also something that we know very much about, but that had been denied. We were gaslighted. We were told it wasn't true, that we were making it up. You said, when we were children. I mean, I'm writing another book now, and I first learned about, police violence when I was 10 because a police officer in New York City killed Clifford Glover, a 10-year-old. I was 10 and the boy was 10 in Queens, where I was growing up. That's my first kind of window into actually even thinking about police in any concrete way. So we're shaped by these things. So when people ask me, oh, is this a new phenomenon, or is it that we now have cell phones, or what happened to Eric Garner? That's an aberration, and yet I have this memory in me from the time I was 10.
I had
So-
a student at Harvard. I want to say he was from Texas, but we were talking about, violence in the South. And he said, well, where I'm from, and it was near the courthouse or some kind of government building. He said, there is what we call the lynching tree.
Mhm.
And so there are these sites in communities, a big tree where the Black community has associated that site, that tree, as the lynching tree, because that's what it was for.
Well, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the wrong tree. I mean, this is part of
Okay.
this is part of what distressed me. And so
Yeah,
if you, and again, it goes back to the name of the book. If you visit these small towns, and I actually happen to very much enjoy the Eastern
Yeah.
Shore of Maryland, I take my kids out to Assateague Island and so forth. But you go to these towns and there's a small square, where the courthouse is, and they're beautiful, and they usually have some kind of war memorial, and they have trees and other beautiful flora and fauna, and some things are trees were donated by particular people, in the community. Or there'll be, mock cannons and other things on the courthouse lawn in these pretty little towns. But this is also where these lynchings happen, and there's no marker. So part of what I wanted to talk about was, there's the ongoing gaslighting of the physical space. Black people are supposed to walk by the courthouse, which is the symbol of justice, and yet that is the site where lynchings happen. There's no plaque that lets you even know which tree it is, right? So, maybe that's the lynching tree, maybe it's not, but because there's no commemoration or acknowledgement in the public space that this ground was also a very contested place in the history of this community. And I think that's really powerful and important. And I will say one of the great moments of satisfaction came just a few years ago. Gosh, it was during COVID, so it must have been 2021. Yeah, it was last year. When in Salisbury, finally, there was a whole ceremony, and family members of Matthew Williams came out from California. Matthew Williams was the man who was lynched. And the mayor was there, and they unveiled a marker, a plaque, describing the events that happened that day. I think that's better than the silence. People think, oh, well, that will scare off people. No, I mean, when I was going out to these tours, people would say, make sure you're not there at night. Are you going by yourself? I mean, I was used to traveling by myself through the South and through rural areas all the time, but people would say that. So the story's there. You're not creating it by identifying what happened. I feel much more comfortable in a community that demonstrates its willingness and openness to confronting its past of racial violence, rather than the whispered ghost story that no one talks about.
Sherilyn, I am really struck by this discussion of white silence about lynching today.
Mhm.
Because as you say, it's really quite the opposite of Black memory. But despite the silence, lynching was not at all hidden by whites in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Mm-mm.
White newspapers explicitly advertised an upcoming lynching. It's not as though these are hidden documents. Photographs taken by whites themselves show crowds of people gathered at a public lynching. Whites sent postcards of lynching to family and friends. Body parts of lynched people were put on display in store windows or taken as souvenirs at the site of a lynching. And I want to give you a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's a famous story. He wrote it in his autobiography, and I quote him. He said, Du Bois, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose,
Mhm.
had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Now, Du Bois recalled that heinous moment to say that the sight made him realize, seeing this made him realize he could not be a detached scholar. And I think that knowledge alone, now, can you hear me? Because my
I
daughter's
can,
telling
I
me
can,
frozen.
I can.
And I think that that knowledge of seeing that,
Mhm.
which wasn't hidden at all, he realized he couldn't be a scholar who believed that knowledge alone could stop this horrendous crime. So I want you to talk more about this problem of white silence and the ways silence can be understood as a form of complicity to what is actually going on.
There's no question. There's no question. And it is, as I said, it's part of gaslighting. It is also an acknowledgement and a recognition by ordinary white people that these grotesque acts, even if the white person was not present or even disapproved, they understood that these acts were taken on their behalf.
Mm.
Lynching was not a murder, right? If you murder someone, in general, you will try to hide it, hide the body, murder in private, wipe down the weapons, right? You'll try to do all the things so that you're not caught. Lynching was a message crime. It was designed to send a message about the boundaries of Black citizenship. And so it was public. It was done in the public. For the most part, in some of the lynchings I researched in the late 1800s and the 1890s, the lynchers wore masks, but not in the 20th century lynchings that I certainly did my deep dive on. So they weren't trying to hide, conceal themselves or conceal their identity. We just talked about the fact that it was on the courthouse lawn. They did, some lynchings took place in the woods, but many were right there. Because remember, they are saying something about who controls the real justice system, right? So the courthouse lawn was a deliberate place. Matthew Williams was in the hospital and they broke into Peninsula Hospital and dragged him out of his bed and dragged him blocks to the courthouse lawn to hang him there. So it was a spot that was selected for lynchings across the country. So it was a public crime, it was a message crime, and therefore the plausible deniability of white people, right? It's they did know. Now maybe they didn't want to know, but they did know. And in the book, I talk quite a bit about silence. I talk not only about the silence of individuals, but institutional silence.
Mm.
The silence of the media, the silence of law enforcement, the silence of political leadership, the silence of white faith leaders. There was a conspiracy of silence. It was understood that this was something not to be discussed. And in trying to unpack what that silence was made of, Dr. Higginbotham, I came to believe that it was made of both fear and shame. But
I just find it so and we'll get to this later about teaching history and teaching the truth in history, because the spectacles of lynching were all through white newspapers themselves. It's not as though anyone could deny that this happened when they are the source of telling you about it. And obviously a lot of this is about control. But as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking about Congress. It's not as though Blacks themselves, in fact, my own grandfather was involved in going to Congress and fighting for anti-lynching laws.
Yeah.
So it's not just everyday people, it's trying to get legislation to go through Congress, which never happened.
Until
this year,
very recently.
last year with the Emmett Till. But could you just say more about that?
Yeah, I want to say first about the press. I want to bring a little bit of complication into this question of silence.
Mhm.
because, you know, in this book, I document a case in which the press refused to talk about it. So there's press and there's press, okay? Most of what I know about, particularly about the victims of lynching, I learned from the Black press. So just as historians, you know, I'm constantly talking about the importance of the Black press. I'm so excited that the
Mhm.
Baltimore Afro-American newspaper is now being digitized. I mean, I had to, you know, go through microfiche, but it is, you know, so the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News, those are the newspapers where they had reporters actually interview the family of the lynching victim. So yes, the New York Times reported about the lynching. The Baltimore Sun reported about the lynching, but they often had the lyncher's name wrong. They had the lyncher's age wrong. They never talked to the lyncher's family, at least not in any way that appeared in the paper. We knew nothing about the lyncher's wife. I wanted to know who Matthew Williams was. It was the Afro that told me that he liked to get his hair processed, you know, on Saturdays at the Acme Beauty Salon. You know, I wanted to know who he was as a person. I learned that he'd lost his parents when he was young and was living with his aunt in Salisbury. Those are things that did not make it into the white press, who even when the mainstream media was condemning lynching, didn't condemn it enough to give humanity to Black victims. So that's one. Number two, the local press often did not want to write about it. So in the book, I document how the Salisbury Times, the local newspaper, when Matthew Williams was lynched in 1931, did not write about the lynching and the mob and the crowd. I had to learn that from other sources. He was lynched on December 4th. So, you know, it's actually quite close to this time. So imagine what it looks like. It's 8 o'clock in the evening. It's dark out. He's dragged from the hospital, maybe 7-ish, and he's hung. The sheriff is on the corner at Main and Division directing traffic, and there are 500 people. The Wicomico Hotel is across the street. As I said, the high school team was in the basement having dinner, so they all come out. All these people are gathered. There are Black men who work in the Wicomico Hotel who are forced up onto the balcony. And so they see part of the dragging before they can get back home. The paper, that's December 4th. So as I'm doing my research, I say, let me find the paper from December 5th, because it's happened at night on December 4th. I will find the Salisbury Times from December 5th, and I will get details about what happened. Get the Salisbury Times, and I look up, you know, top right hand side, nothing. It says something like Negro Slayer, you know, believed to have killed, like whatever crazy thing they said about the underlying crime for which he was accused, not ever with just word of mouth. And I couldn't believe it. I thought I had the wrong paper. I said, maybe I had the wrong date. I mean, I'm sure they must have written about it, but I'm looking above the fold because it seems like a pretty big story for a small town to have 500 people lynching somebody on the courthouse lawn. But then I look below the fold, and below the fold, in a block, is a section that says a statement in bold. And the statement is from the publishers of the paper, who say, we will not report on the demonstration that happened last night for the simple reason that everyone knows what happened. We always have the best interests of our community at heart, and we know others from outside our community will try to exploit the events of last night to make broad generalizations, so on and so forth. So they make a decision not to report on the lynching. And I just want to be clear that there are differing levels of media who are engaged in this. The Black press is the most, and remember how brave you have to be. Clarence Mitchell, the lion in the lobby, the NAACP lobbyist, is a reporter for the Afro in 1933 when George Armwood is lynched. And when George Armwood is taken from the Baltimore City jail, where he had been taken for safekeeping, and he's brought back by the sheriff to the Eastern Shore, everybody knows what that means. He's going to be lynched. The only men who were accused of killing white people who escaped being lynched on the Eastern Shore during that period were taken by a sheriff to Baltimore City, to the Baltimore City jail for safekeeping. So he was taken, but the sheriff then ordered him back. So he's coming back. Everyone knows what's going to happen. And Clarence Mitchell, Black man, gets in a car and drives with his friend to the Eastern Shore. There's no Bay Bridge, so he's doing the long ride through Delaware for 10 hours. And someone gives him a gun. He says, I don't use guns, I've never used. He puts it under the seat. He arrives the next morning, he's got his press pass on his hat, and he walks through the town where everybody is excited and, sharing pieces of rope. And he starts interviewing people. And so the account we have of George Armwood's lynching comes from a Black man who had every reason to be afraid, walking through the throngs of still excited white people to get this story. But if you look in the white press, including in the Baltimore Sun, where the lynching is condemned, you get none of this flavor. That picture in my book of the mother and sister of George Armwood, I found in the files of the Afro. So I want to be clear, it's an opportunity to talk about the importance of the Black press to documenting and holding history. And it's also an opportunity to talk about the white press in multiple ways, which is one, silencing, but the other piece is not providing anything that goes to the humanity of the victims and treating it purely as a kind of political moment, which is what the mainstream media did. And then, of course, you're right about Congress. The Costigan-Wagner bill, there were two bills, including one in the 1920s, and then in 1934. And largely, the lynchings of Matthew Williams and George Armwood were center stage in the hearing for the 1934 bill, because people were very concerned about these lynchings that happened in Maryland, so close to Washington, D.C. Maryland is not a deep South state. And so there was real concern. In addition, the governor of the state, Albert Ritchie, actually he did call out the National Guard to arrest the lynchers. And the National Guard was met by a crowd of hundreds of white people in the town of Salisbury, who repelled the National Guard when they came to arrest the men believed to have been involved in the lynching. So this was something very close to Washington, D.C., very volatile, and it became really kind of a centerpiece of the hearings on the Costigan-Wagner bill, which ultimately did not pass, of course, because segregationist senators refused to allow it to do so.
When I think of those kind of lynchings that were advertised ahead of time and all that, those are usually the Deep South. And those kind of Deep South activities, I think, are expected when scholars, when you hear about lynching, you think of Alabama, you think of Mississippi, you think, in fact, when you go to the memorial, the Peace and Justice Memorial, it's just amazing how many names are on those pillars. But I think that what you show us, though, is that it's not just happening in the Deep South.
No.
It might be more brazen and more numerous in the Deep South, but it's still happening next door.
Well,
And
listen,
so
the quadruple lynching in 1922 in Duluth, Minnesota, is one of the most notorious.
Yeah, I think that was like on a light post, just lamp post, or
Yes,
something,
black
street lamp post.
carnival workers were,
Yeah, it's just so you don't think, but when you were talking about the Eastern Shore, and I think for those of us who grew up in DC, we're very, and in Maryland, we're very conscious of that location. I found also intriguing the way you began that first chapter by talking about monuments as sacred public spaces, and then that fierce debate in Talbot County about should we honor Frederick Douglass, memorialize Frederick Douglass, which it just was an amazing. Could you share that story with the audience, because it was pretty amazing.
It was pretty amazing. So this is, I'm thinking 2004 maybe. There's a huge debate that is being that is tearing the community apart in Easton, Maryland, which is in Talbot County. Pretty little town, Talbot. I go there often and have lunch. And Talbot County's most famous son is Frederick Douglass, who was enslaved on a plantation in Talbot County. And in fact, when I first moved to Maryland, people would say to me all the time, Maryland was not a slave state. And I would say, that's so funny. Name the two most famous, enslaved people you could think of. And it's always Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who both were enslaved on the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Absolutely.
One in Dorchester County and one in Talbot. But anyway, Frederick Douglass had, escaped from Talbot County. You know, I think we all know the story of his extraordinary life. He actually had returned to Talbot to meet with the sheriff who had jailed him. He had been in jail right there in Easton, and gave a speech kind of forgiving the sheriff. I mean, you know, he'd had a tremendous engagement with this particular community. And Black residents wanted to erect a memorial to Frederick Douglass on the lawn of the courthouse. White residents, but particularly white veterans, were outraged and said that this memorial could not go forward because the courthouse lawn in Easton, they said, is reserved for commemorating those who gave their lives for our country. And essentially what they were saying is it's for war memorials. And indeed, there are war memorials on the courthouse lawn. There's a Korean war memorial, there's a Vietnam war memorial, and then there's a memorial to the Talbot boys. And the Talbot boys were a group of men, I want to say maybe 30 men from Talbot County who joined the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Now remember, Maryland is neither fish nor fowl because Lincoln recognizes that Maryland, again, is too close to Washington, D.C., has a very strong Southern sentiments. And so he brings the army in to make sure that Maryland cannot join the Confederacy. And so Maryland never joins the Confederacy, but Maryland's got quite a Confederate heart. We know John Wilkes Booth was from Maryland. But in particular, there were soldiers like these Talbot boys who signed up to join voluntarily to fight on the side of the Confederacy. And these boys, young men, died. And in 1911, a monument was erected, just as this the same period of time when Confederate monuments are being erected across the country. It happens here in Easton in 1911 that there is this monument to the Talbot boys, and that's on the courthouse lawn. So what the veterans say is that the courthouse lawn, and they described it as hallowed ground, sacred ground for the reserved for the commemoration of those who fought in wars. And the local NAACP and Black residents, there are these hearings, these contentious city council hearings. I mean, it's incredibly ugly. People are saying we've never had, you know, racial tension like this. This controversy is pulling us apart. And my concern is that, you know, the NAACP and Black residents are saying, yes, but, you know, Frederick Douglass was instrumental in convincing Lincoln that Black men should fight with the Union Army, which we all know they did, including Frederick Douglass's sons, that he himself was going to be commissioned, but there were fears that white soldiers might not listen to him, that he himself fought, you know, for our country, and therefore he should be commemorated. And so that was, I thought those were perfectly fine arguments, but I was more concerned about this idea that of who gets to decide what is sacred and hallowed ground and reserved for what. Because my research had uncovered that not very long after, maybe 10 years after the Talbot Boy statue was erected, 2,000 people white people had gathered on that courthouse lawn to try to lynch a man named Isaiah Fountain, who had been on trial for the murder of a 14-year-old white girl. And at the end of the first day of trial, as they were getting ready to transfer him back to the jail, there were 2,000 people who had decided one day of trial was enough, and they were going to lynch him. The sheriff pushed him back into the jail to try to talk to the crowd, but he understood what the deal was, and so he ran. And he escaped that night. He ran all the way to Delaware. The local judge deputized 250 men to search for him, and they found him. And they brought him back, and he was tried. He was actually tried twice. His first conviction was thrown out because it was a mob atmosphere. He had a very good white lawyer. And he was tried a second time and convicted, and he was executed, still maintaining his innocence. He was executed, I want to say I think it was on Good Friday, or it was Easter weekend. You know, he insisted on wearing a purple robe and a crown, and you know, considered himself a martyr. And
Mhm.
But that's what happened on that ground. So I wanted to understand what made this ground so sacred, because apparently the 2,000 people who were going to murder and dismember somebody didn't think that way at all. And yet there's no acknowledgement that this incredible event happened. We're talking about tiny towns with a population of 10,000. And 2,000 people are out there to lynch this man. So that to me is about this question of who gets to control, to identify, um, to narrate the truth about our public spaces. And we saw
Absolutely.
this on display with the pull down of the Confederate monuments in 2020, that there is a contest. There's another story about what these public spaces mean. It's not just what white people say it is. And we have a
Absolutely.
right to participate in that conversation. And I will say that about 6 or 7 years later, the monument to Frederick Douglass was finally erected on that courthouse lawn as well.
Thank you. That was really, really good, informative. I'd like to take you back to South Africa too, because it's really interesting. I find in the book the way you contrast really America's response to racial injustice to that of South Africa after the end of apartheid. And you specifically talk about post-apartheid South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you say, and I quote you, that it was making the job of forgetting difficult for whites. It was making the job of forgetting difficult for whites. And you seem to see a difference between the United States and South Africa, even though you are aware of certain limitations and even failures in the South African
Of
efforts.
course.
But I wanted you to talk more about the South African model of truth telling in relation to the role of institutions. I'm not sure that everybody on the in our audience even knows about the commission. But one of the things I found really important is that, under the regime of South African apartheid, the role of institutions, their very purpose was enforcing and perpetuating white supremacy. And there are definitely comparisons to be made with the role of institutions during the era of Jim Crow and even today, though perhaps a bit more subtle. So I thought it'd be really good for you to talk about the South African Commission and why you brought that into your narrative.
Well, I'd never heard anything quite like this before, and so much attention was being understandably paid to the stories of individuals who testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about horrible violence and human rights violations that they had endured or witnessed. And very little attention, at least here in the United States, was paid to the fact that there were a whole set of what they called institutional hearings. And this was important to me because in my research and experience in Germany, in South Africa, and my research about Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, it was very clear to me that, and is very clear to me, that mass violence, genocide, cannot happen without the complicity of institutions. So when we talk about, I think it actually comforts people to feel like it's just about individuals, because that allows them to make the bad apples defense, right? When I do lots of work around police violence, and that's what they want. They want to say, yes, that officer shouldn't have done what he did, but there's no systemic problem, right?
Yes.
They don't want to get to the institutional root of the thing. But you can't carry it out. You can't kill 6 million people. You can't kill 800,000 people in 4 months, as happened in Rwanda. And you cannot conduct a system over decades in which the majority population is oppressed, as they were under apartheid in South Africa, and subject to degradation, statelessness, violence, and so forth, without institutional complicity. What do I mean by institutions? I mean by the complicity of the legal system, the complicity of the media, the complicity of the health system, the complicity of the faith institutions, right? So South Africa had institutional hearings. They had institutional hearings for, the judges, which was, I thought was, fascinating and so important. None of the judges came, of course, but they had the hearing anyway. They had media hearings, right? Where the institutions had to be held to account for their role in turning a blind eye or participating in, even in their reporting, the dehumanization of Black people. This to me is something that has been so missing in the US, and we sometimes see it. We see individual newspapers. The Baltimore Sun recently did it. Newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky did it. We sometimes see these efforts by institutional actors, individual ones, to apologize for their role. The newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky apologized for the fact that they did not report on the local civil rights movement. In other words, there were sit-ins and marches, and they decided they weren't going to cover it. So they would cover civil rights actions that happened outside of Lexington, but they would not cover actions that happened in their own city. And so they're not only did they confess to this and apologize for it, but they then did stories as though of these things that happened that they never reported on, because they had photographs and they had taken photographs. They knew what was happening, but they had chosen not to report on it. So we see these individual things, but we don't see a kind of an institutional accounting. And this is so relevant to us in this moment. We are all aware of the deep failings of the mainstream media in the 2016 election, but her emails, the failure to recognize the white supremacy that was on the rise, the racism of Trump. The words white supremacy weren't even used until after Charlottesville, when the evidence was laid bare. This man could stand up for a presidential debate and have no one ask him about the suit that had been brought against him and his father by the Department of Justice for housing discrimination in the 70s. There was this skewing of the story and the way they reported on Trump during the presidency. Now we see newspapers describing something as a lie, but it took almost 3 years for papers to even call the things that he was saying lies. But we haven't seen the media come together in reflection to say, let's have a conference and talk about what our standards are. Well, our standards were built for a different time. I take to task my own profession, and I'm trying to goad my profession to do this work now. That yes, there is law, but much of the conduct that we expect lawyers to engage in is also covered by norms. And what happens when you have a set of actors who are willing to blast through those norms? How do we maintain a profession? And how do we call to account those who abused the privilege of being part of this confession? What are we saying to the doctors who said it was okay for parents and children to be separated, from nursing babies to be separated from their moms? I went through this with lynching. Who are the coroners who signed the death certificates, right? Who described the deaths in certain kinds of ways. The same in South Africa. He jumped out the window, of the police station again, the fourth one this month, right? How do we deal with that? And we see it with police violence. If you look at the police report that was filed by the officer who killed Walter Scott, the 53-year-old man running in that park in North Charleston who was shot in the back. The police report doesn't say that he was running away. It says the police officer was under threat and in the struggle, right? When we look at the police report, and it's only activists who pushed that issue. Otherwise, it would have just gone the way of so many others that we don't even know. Look at what happened in Chicago with Laquan McDonald, where the police report said he was coming at them with a knife. And then we see the video that had been suppressed for more than a year, and this child is walking away. So where are we holding to account the institutional responses of a media that always takes the word of the police, that considers investigating the murder of a young Black man that is sufficient to look at the police report? The police report is one piece of evidence. And if you haven't talked to one Black person in that community, you haven't really investigated it. Because the truth is, this is the world that we live in. And there is such a thing as police violence against unarmed Black people. There is racism, there is white supremacy. So part of the way we failed is the way what I thought was South Africa was doing so powerfully and so expertly in ways that had not really ever been done before in quite this way. The Nuremberg trials had some elements of it, but it still was focused on individuals. The institutional hearings really compelled institutions to look at their practices writ large, not some bad actor, some dilatory reporter, but the way in which the norms and ethics of institutions of civil society support and advance white supremacy. You cannot have this kind of mass violence without it. And if we think about, the kinds of things that we've been witness to the ongoing scourge of police violence against unarmed African Americans, if we look at the family separation policy, if we look at these practices, these are areas where the press has failed, where the legal system has failed, where prosecutors who know the truth have failed. Prosecutors know who the bad officers are. If they're bad apples, you know who knows who they're bad apples? The prosecutors. So what are they doing about it? Maintaining a list of police officers that you won't call to trial because you, the prosecutor, don't think they're trustworthy. That is quite telling. You're not indicting those officers, but you're keeping a list. And you're knowing that you won't call them to testify at trial because you don't find them to be credible witnesses because you know they've planted evidence and so forth. I mean, we have a system in which those kinds of things are accepted. Every week. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating. I'm definitely underplaying it when I say every month. Every month we open the paper and some person is released from prison after serving at least 15 or 20 years for a crime they did not commit. And we just read it and we keep it moving. It doesn't shut the country down. It doesn't shut the justice system down. It doesn't, we just keep moving. And yet I'm part of a whole profession that gets its, of individuals who get their identity and their status from being part of this profession. And yet this profession can regularly churn out this result. And you hear not a peep from the institutions of our profession. So but my attraction to the institutional hearings in the South African TRC was that I think that's the piece that is always missing. And what white supremacy wants is for you to focus on individual bad actors and not on the system itself. And part of being a civil rights lawyer is that I'm a lawyer who challenges systemic injustice. It's not that I'm not interested in the individual, I am, but I'm more interested in the system that allows that individual to do what they do and sometimes sanctions it and sometimes encourages it.
And you are a person who sees this firsthand. This is why you're talking to us is so important, because you are right there seeing it firsthand in the courts and in the prisons and in all these other places. The other thing I was thinking that you said, like, what can be done? And one of the things that you emphasize, I think, in your book is projects that have aspects of reconciliation and reparation. So could you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with the language. I just haven't come up with other words for it, but the prefix "re" applies that we're doing over something that we did, and we're reconciling as though we ever were together. You reconcile when you were together and then you broke up and then you reconcile, right? But I don't know that we were ever together, right? As Black people and white people in this country in any shared sense of justice or history. But I think that there's always this rush to get to, the healing and the forgiving and and I think it's important to identify concretely. And I take the word reparation for its actual meaning. How do we repair the damage that was done? I don't equate reparation with a check.
Yeah.
Sometimes money is critical to the reparation process, but actually that's cheap. And I think it also silences the voice of communities that were victimized by these actions. It's been interesting to hear the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, because transportation discrimination is very important to me in my work. And that case that I was working on the Eastern Shore was a transportation case. And so, you know, the phenomenon of driving highways through Black communities, through historic Black communities, you know, what do you do about that? You destroyed a whole community. You know, if you stand at the corner of Route 50 and Route 13 on the Eastern Shore in Salisbury, you know, you'll see at the very edge, you'll see an old church hanging off, you know, because they literally ran these highways through these Black communities. So, you know, money is one way to talk about it, but Pete Buttigieg started to talk about, like, can you undo some of these highways? You know, I think it's very provocative, right? You know, to let's have a conversation about the range of things that are available in the context of lynching. You know, I think investigations into the underlying crime, clearing the name of lynching victims who were very often wrongly accused of committing crimes. You know, changing information on the death certificates, finding, you know, George Armwood's body was thrown in the paupers, you know, cemetery behind the almshouse. You know, giving a proper burial to people. Matthew Williams, I believe he's buried under the parking lot of the local utility company. Black people were sometimes afraid to come and even claim the body. You know, the most powerful thing in Emmett Till is, you know, if you watch the movie Till, which I do recommend, and I was hesitant about watching it, but it's really quite excellent. You know, the demand for I have to see him. I have to have my son. I have to bring him back. You know, there were many instances because, you know, lynchings were often accompanied by, you know, what I call pogroms, right? Where white people were marauding through the streets, setting Black businesses on fire. So very often people were afraid to come and claim the body. So, you know, appropriate burial, headstones for unmarked graves, apologies are part of reparation, and yes, money. But it's a whole wealth of things. And of course, making institutional changes, right? What can the newspaper currently do? How does it currently cover the Black community? How do police officers and DAs engage with police brutality or crimes against Black people? You know, to reconciliation and reparation actually opens up and should open up a menu of potential ways in which repair can take place. And it's not just a check. That will not bring repair. It can be a part of and should be a part of it. It certainly shouldn't be off the table. It should be a part of a regime of repair, but we should not limit ourselves to solely that.
The other question I want to, this is the next to the last question, but in your book, you know, as you come to the end, you use two adjectives. One adjective is hopeful, and the other adjective is pragmatic. And you use those two adjectives to describe the book's emphasis on truth-telling. And you use it in 2018,
Yeah.
and, you know, it sticks out in 2008 probably. But thinking about those words, hopeful and pragmatic, thinking about those words, given the assault on teaching the truth, indeed teaching historical facts in schools today, how do you think about your book in 2022? Do you have a different perspective, one less hopeful, less pragmatic, or, Sherilyn, one more hopeful and more pragmatic since the book was published in 2008? And I ask this for two reasons. Because in 2008, we weren't faced with politicians and others as we are today, who fashioned their political agendas around passing laws to silence and suppress the truth about American history. And my second reason for asking about being hopeful and pragmatic today is because of the exponential rise of social media and viral videos that simply did not exist when you first published On the Courthouse Lawn in 2008. So what does being hopeful and pragmatic mean today?
So, you know, my book had modest success, like it wasn't, you know, a bestseller or anything. And
Let me tell you, people are going to want to buy your book after this conversation.
Well, that's good to hear. And I encourage people to teach with it also, because I think there's a lot there. But
Excellent.
you know, when I wrote the book, I can tell you that I could not possibly have imagined that the state of Maryland would actually pass a law creating a lynching project and a truth commission, which functions as we speak. It's called the Maryland Lynching Project, that holds hearings, that is responsible for that sign that I talked about in Salisbury.
Mhm.
I'm not even very involved with their work. They invite me to things all the time. I try to participate when I can. But I remember feeling like this book is my gift to the community, because I don't want our community to be gaslit anymore. These events actually happened. These people actually participated. Prominent members of the community were part of this. And this community needs to have the truth. And then it's still up to them what they do with it. But if you had told me that this would happen in Maryland, if you had told me that there would be a national lynching museum in Alabama,
Yeah.
I would have had a hard time believing it. So I want to say that the conversation has been very, very powerful, but not just about lynching. And this brings me to your point about the anti-truth laws, which is what we should be calling them, not anti-CRT, they're anti-truth laws,
Mhm.
which are deeply anti-democratic and very frightening. You know, these are laws that we see at the beginning of the rise of authoritarian regimes. So it's a democracy issue. This is not just a Black people issue. This is a sign. We have to properly diagnose the source of this. And the source is that they are a response to our success in compelling that the conversation about race truthfully. The reason that I know this is because the same was true in the voting rights space. The 2021 voter suppression laws in Georgia, Florida, and other places around the country were a response to the overwhelming, determined turnout of
Mhm.
Black and brown voters in 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic, right? The reason the Georgia law says you can't give refreshments to people standing online is because voters stood online in Fulton County, Georgia for 9 hours in the presidential primary in 2020, right? So they were a response. Likewise, the anti-truth laws are a response to what happened in 2020. And there were two things that happened that created this fear among white people,
Mhm.
some at least, and their response. First and foremost was the move to pull down Confederate monuments. I don't think we have adequately diagnosed how deeply traumatic this was
Mhm.
for many white people. For the same reason that the monuments were created. The monuments were created to fashion a truth, to advance this idea of the lost cause, to
Mhm.
create a story of nobility rather than loss and
Treason.
failure and treason and immorality in the
Mhm.
South. So it was created to force and create a narrative about who these people were and what they were about. And the monuments were placed, and if you live in a community where these monuments exist, they're huge and they're high up and they're heavy and they are meant to dominate and to overwhelm the narrative. And I think we underestimated how the pulling down of those monuments, seeing them go past you on the back of a truck, which I loved, how deeply traumatic that was. And how the conversation about the lost cause, people who'd never heard about the lost cause before learned about the role of the, daughters of the American Revolution, the daughters of the Confederacy in shaping our textbooks to tell a certain story about the South that ennobled the cause of the South. All of this, that wonderful image of George Floyd's face on the Confederate monuments, with the graffiti around, in Virginia, this was
Richmond, yeah.
huge. The second, of course, were the protests of tens of millions of people in this country and around the world after George Floyd was killed. It's not that they hadn't seen videos of police violence.
Mhm.
It's not as though they hadn't seen Eric Garner choked to death.
Mhm.
It's not as though they hadn't seen Walter Scott shot in that park, or Samuel DuBose shot in his car, or Alton Sterling in Louisiana, or Philando Castile bleed out in his car in St. Paul.
Mm.
It wasn't as though they didn't see Terrence Crutcher with his hands up in Oklahoma, and the officer saying that's a bad dude.
Mm.
We saw all of this, but there was something about that nearly 9 minutes of torture that enough was enough.
Mhm.
And white people, not just Black people, came out by the millions in every state. It's the largest set of civil rights protests this country has ever seen. It was in all 50 states and around
And
the
in
world.
places around the world.
And
actually.
around the world.
Mhm.
What moved those people to come out? What moved young people to leave their parents' home in the midst of a global pandemic? Remember, this is June. We've got no vaccine. This is early June
Right.
2020. People risked their lives to come out and protest what they saw. How did that happen? What moved them? What moved them, of course, was empathy. And I talked about this in 2020 and 2021. It was empathy. And what we're seeing in these anti-truth laws is not just the desire to shut off the truth and the historical facts, but is to shut off the valve of empathy, to make sure that never happens again, that their children don't turn against them because they now know the truth. You are supposed to feel, if you read the laws, the actual laws that are passed, they describe outline teaching that gives feelings of discomfort, guilt, or shame on account of race. And I always say when I talk about this, I was in a conversation with former Secretary Clinton about this, and I said, when I was in the 6th grade, I read the Diary of Anne Frank. And I felt guilt and shame. I mean, not that I had done anything or that my family had done anything, as a human being. As a human being, looking at the experience of another human being, I felt guilt and shame. That's what you're supposed to feel. That's empathy. That's called empathy. And that's what you want to awaken in young people, right? I never thought about really in any deep way about mentally disabled people until I read of Mice and Men as a child, right? We awaken empathy in children by having them read these texts that expose them to a world they don't know. And it wakes up and stirs up feelings in you that put you in greater touch with your humanity and with the universality of our humanity. And that's what they want to cut off, because that's what got awakened when they saw that video of George Floyd. That's what was awakened when we had that extended conversation about what the Confederacy was really about. So understand, when you begin to then understand it as a reaction to our success, then I am able to be hopeful. I am quite horrified, and hopeful doesn't mean that I know we're not going to go through some very difficult times. But when I know that what you're doing is a reaction to my success, I would be foolish not to spend a moment, twirling on my success, twirling on the fact that we got it out there. We held that narrative in such a way that it frightened the heck out of them. And
no, I love that. I mean, hope is what keeps us fighting. It keeps us in the struggle.
if we underestimate our own power, then we give it away.
We give it away.
And we have to be careful. We are facing perilous times. We may not come out of this a democracy. It's that serious. But we should not underestimate our power.
That's beautiful. One last question before we turn it over. So you're working on a new book, and it's tentatively titled, Is This America? It always reminds me of, remember Fannie Lou Hamer at the 1964,
that's the
Is this
inspiration.
America, the land of the brave and the
Yes.
home of the whatever? Anyway, tell us about
That's
your
the
new project.
inspiration. That's the inspiration. The book is about how we got here, and if we're going to become a healthy democracy, how we get there. And centrally, the book is about the continuing role of racism and white supremacy in undermining the project of democracy in this country. We will never make it until we're able to confront this truth But it is also about, because of course, is this America? It's Fannie Lou Hamer asking that question. This is, you know, a woman who was a sharecropper from Indianola, Mississippi. Not a woman of letters, uneducated largely. And when she asked that question, is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our phones off the hook
Yeah.
because we want to live as decent people? She's asking a rhetorical question at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. And the implication, of course, is that this is America,
Mhm,
that she knows something about America that these
Mhm.
folks in this room do not know.
mhm.
And that is the reality of Black people. So if America wants to save itself as a democracy, they better start listening to the voices of the people who know. And the theory of the book is that the people who know the most about where the fault lines are, about the weaknesses in our democracy, are the people who regularly encounter them, who live at the margins and who live at the bottom. You don't talk to the most successful people to find out what the weaknesses are in your democracy.
Right.
And yet every night and every Sunday, we listen to pundits talk about what is happening in our political system and
Right.
our economic system, and we very rarely center the voices of the people that I've been privileged to represent, who and the communities I've been privileged to live in,
Mhm.
the voices of people who actually know something. And without that knowledge and without drawing on the expertise of those voices, we will not be able to not only save democracy, because I'm not in the business of just focusing on saving democracy. We either want a healthy democracy or we don't. And I don't think we make it unless we address the sickness in our democracy and commit ourselves to building a healthy one.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative and so inspiring. I want
Thank
to
you.
turn over to our audience who may have questions. So I'm going to yield my time now to the questions. Michelle, do you want to?
Dr. Higginbotham, I got our questions for us.
Oh,
Just a
thank you.
reminder, if you want to add your questions to the Q&A, that would be very helpful. Our first question comes from Pam M. She asked, how many Black lynchings have historians documented at this time, and how many more people do you believe do we believe happened?
Goodness, well, since the 1880s, we think nearly 5,000, but we find new stories all the time.
Mhm.
You know, people who allegedly went missing. So I'm sure it's many more than that. You know, and that's just lynching. That's not even people just being run out of town, or there's just so much violence that was done and buried. And so there's more than enough work for historians to dig up and excavate these truths.
She also had another question. It says, can you comment on the recently published Pew Research poll that shows the very significant disparity between whites, Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians who support reparations of descendants of enslaved people? And then we have the link if you needed to reference the article or if you haven't seen it.
No, not really. I think that, you know, look, there's a way in which the reparations conversation has been molded as well, right? That it is, you know, everybody wants a check. As I said, there's no reason to take money off the table or to be ashamed of talking about money, because white supremacy has been theft at the largest scale of Black labor, of Black success, of Black potential. So there's no reason that we shouldn't talk about it. But you know, it has produced this kind of eye-rolling response from many people. And I think having had the hearing on HR 40, the bill to study reparations in the House, where Ta-Nehisi Coates testified several years ago, was really a powerful, important step. Another thing I perhaps did not believe I would see quite so soon. So I was thrilled by that as well. But it doesn't surprise me that there is this resistance to it. And that's part of why the truth telling needs to happen. When I was talking about reparations in the context of this book and the research I've done, and remember, you know, I've tried to dig down and tell the true and human stories of these individuals who were lynched, you know, on the Eastern Shore during this particular time period. But in the course of researching this book, I've read hundreds of accounts of lynchings and probably seen every photograph that exists. And this is a massive scale. Dr. Higginbotham just talked about when you walk up to the museum. Even I, who knew so much, what got me was just when you're far away and you see all the pylons, hanging from every county. We're talking about something in a macro sense that existed at a micro level. And I did differ kind of from Brian. In my book, I talk about the need for these local processes because, and he incorporated that into his theory of the museum. But I don't think that white people on the Eastern Shore, for the most part, are going to the museum in Alabama. I want them to have to stumble over it. I want them every time they have to walk downtown that they have to walk past that sign. So he did incorporate that into it, where people bring the soil from different communities and so forth. So, but the truth telling, I mean to say, has to happen in order for people to understand what the need for the reparation is. But when I was writing this book, what people kept saying to me? I would say, I really think we need to be talking about this. We need to tell the truth about what happened. We need to engage the question of how we repair the damage that was done. And the response I would get from many white people was, slavery was a really long time ago. And I would say, wait a minute, I didn't write about slavery. I wrote about lynching.
Right.
There is a way in which there's almost these trained responses when you say the word reparations.
Right.
And I believe that there needs to be reparations for chattel slavery in this country, but I also think there needs to be reparations for Jim Crow and for lynching, right? I mean, if you arrived in the United States and your forebears, and you were Black and your forebears were not slaves, but your relative was lynched, I think you should get reparations for lynching. You shouldn't get necessarily for slavery, but there are so many elements to the injustices of white supremacy. But I think it's important also for us not to let those off the hook. Jim Crow was a massive, massive economic theft of Black communities after Congress, with the passage of the Civil War amendments, had decided that Black people were to be full citizens with equal rights to white people, and that promise was stolen. So we can't just wipe that slate clean. We need to understand what that really means, what it means that we have these disparities in wealth in Black and white communities, and in the value of homes in Black and white communities. All of that was created and manufactured by public policy. And so we can't just blow past that.
We have a question from Reverend Janet Garner Mullins, who asks, what can the Black faith community do in 2022 to help change the narrative around systematic racism and educate their congregation?
Yeah, I've actually been talking about this with some faith leaders. I'm grateful for the question, because the faith community is yet another institution that has to be held to account and has to see a role for themselves. Obviously, the Black church has a role to play. And, if I'm frank, I think that focusing attention on our survival and humanity is more important than, the kind of condemnatory practice of Christianity that we see in some churches. I think that it's really important that we understand that our very survival is at stake. And I would hope that what has been revealed over the last 10 or so years demonstrates that for us. We have a proud tradition in the Black church. Oliver Brown was an assistant pastor in the AME church, the plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education. Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. I mean, we have, not to mention the modern civil rights movement. And the Black church has been a part of that. And I think we need to re-engage and re-embrace that. I think worrying about whether people are having sex before marriage at this moment, when we are trying to survive, is probably not the most important emphasis. So I would like to see, the Black church really take the lead with a powerful message of faith and of witness and of sacrifice that is so much a part of our history. I also think the Black church must challenge the white church, as Martin Luther King did in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. We basically now have an open and explicit call to white Christian nationalism. which is just white supremacy with a veneer of some, elements of Christianity, of Old Testament, condemnation, very little to do with Jesus. But they're calling this out openly, and I'm not hearing our faith leaders push back against this and say there's no such thing, and that any effort to use the veneer of Christianity to cover essentially what is a smash and grab job on our democracy, what is an effort to continue to fuel hate and to suggest who doesn't belong and who does belong, is contrary to Christianity, is a betrayal of the tenets of Christianity. This is a moment when the Black church should be speaking. And I would say not even just the Black church. It should be, that's where the challenge comes in. The Black church should be standing with Lutherans and with Presbyterians and with those Baptists who, put Christ before their race. All of that we should be seeing a pushback on this hijacking of a faith that has been so important to Black people in their development. And that is not to exclude, Muslims from the conversation or people of any other faith in the Black community. But there is a specific effort to use Christianity by white nationalists. And to me, that feels like a direct challenge that I don't think has been sufficiently met at the moment.
Have a few more questions as well. Ryan Napoli asks, do you think there's a connection between the rise of the far right and the throwing overboard of William Patterson, Robeson et al. In the 1950s?
Hi, Ryan. So Ryan's my former student. I haven't seen Ryan in probably, 12, 13 years. So it's wonderful. I'm so glad you've joined, and you always did great work and were so committed to the cause of justice. I don't know how to answer that, Ryan. I don't know that. I mean, I think it's all connected. I don't think there's any element of, the performance of white supremacy that is disconnected from the whole. I think white supremacy is an ideology that lives in this country, that is part of it's in the roots and the soil, and so it has to be confronted and dealt with and managed. The best we can do is manage it. It is now unmanaged. And that's when it's dangerous, right? It was unmanaged during massive resistance, So it's not as though things feel worse because we didn't used to have white supremacy 15 years ago and now we do. No, we had it then too, but there was a level of management. So I don't feel like white supremacy ever went away, and therefore it's a continuum. The question, if you want to be a healthy and functioning democracy, is that you have to be able to look your weaknesses squarely in the eye, and then you create the systems that can contain that which is harmful to the democracy and can promote that which is helpful. We have public education because it helps democracy, right? Chief Justice Earl Warren and Brown called it the very foundation of citizenship, education. Right. So we have things that we think will strengthen democracy, but then we know that we also have weaknesses, and we create policies to manage those weaknesses. And unfortunately, there's often been this kind of laziness about confronting white supremacy. The Supreme Court, 20 years after slavery in the civil rights cases, in the 1880s was saying, how long must we protect the Black man? I mean, there's always been, as Professor Darren Hutchinson would say, this racial exhaustion. White people just exhausted having a conversation we've never had. So I think it's all part of the same continuum. I wouldn't specifically pick that out as the connective tissue, but I don't think any of it is unrelated.
All right, our next question comes from Jermaine Archer. Can you speak to the silence of Black artists who drew about lynchings in the back in the 19th century, Black 19th century newspapers, and how your work continues the legacy of Ida B. Wells and so many others?
Well, I'm very flattered to be regarded as continuing the work of Ida B. Wells, who's a real hero for me. You know, her work's so important, and it also shows you what could have been done, right? Because, you know, people love to say, well, this was so long ago and it wasn't quite the same, and people weren't, you know, doing this kind of work. And but she was an investigative reporter. She didn't believe the received story, you know. She again was brave and took it upon herself to investigate and find out what was really happening in these cases. Um, and so I think her example is a really powerful one. It's a powerful one for journalism. And, you know, I love to see Nicole Hannah-Jones walking in that tradition as well, now teaching at Howard, and creating a center that will train young Black journalists to walk in the footsteps of Ida B. Wells. With regard to artists, you said 19th century artists. That I don't know so much about. 20th century, early 20th century. Yes, there was, you know, art was a way. There were these salons, you know, where people would talk about lynching, where artists would display their you know, paintings about lynching. Many of the short stories of Langston Hughes and other writers from the Harlem Renaissance have lynching as a theme or as a core part of it. And so art was the only way people could really express in some instances the outrage of lynching, you know, during the early part of the 20th century. You know, in a club, in a cabaret where you might hear Billie Holiday sing Strange Fruit, right? Or hear Meeropol recite the poem. These were kind of, you know, private salons and events where the artistic community could come together to talk about this scourge. And artists also were very involved in raising money for the NAACP and others who were trying to deal with, you know, doing anti-lynching work and also trying to support the families of victims.
Great. So we have a lot of questions, but we are
Yeah.
running out of time. So we are weeding through the questions to find the best ones.
Okay.
Our next one comes from Michael Edwards. It says, do you think we fall into a trap when we talk about reparations only as a moral issue versus a legal argument, which is what we need to do in a court of law because that is the background?
Well, many have tried. Many have tried. There have been a number of cases that have been unsuccessful. The Tulsa case is going forward now. That the judge, it's being brought on a theory of public nuisance. You know, lawyers have been hard at work for many years trying to find a way. You know, one of the best recordings I have ever heard, I wonder if I could find the link for you and put it in the chat, is of a case that brought on behalf of someone who was able to find records and determine that she's a descendant of slaves in a particular area, and the suit is filed against insurance companies who insured slaves during the period. And about, I want to say 20 years ago, I also, one of the clinics I started at Maryland Law School was a reparations clinic. I still think it's the only one in the country. And I really have to lift it up, and I pull out my old syllabus. And I loved that class very much. But this case was argued in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And it's one of the most powerful arguments I've ever heard on making a legal case for reparations. It did, of course, did not prevail, but it laid it all out. And I think I can find this. I really do.
Can I
Hold
just
on.
add something about the case about Tulsa, which is so interesting, though, is that there were many legal suits that occurred right after, and they did not prevail.
No. And
And
so when
then
they say,
at the
why didn't you
beginning-
do it? Why didn't you do it then?
But they never gave up. So then by the early 2000s, you had that famous John Melvin Alexander et al.
Oh, yeah,
who- of
Ogletree's
which
case. Yeah.
John Hope
Mhm.
Franklin, our own John Hope Franklin, was one of the plaintiffs.
That's right.
And
That's
that
right.
didn't work. But they
Yeah.
keep fighting.
But they keep fighting. And so this
And
latest
that's what you
one,
gotta do.
that's what you got to do. This latest one is brought on, with a claim of public nuisance. I think it's brilliant. And, the person who's been really the lawyer who's been spearheading it is Demario Solomon Simmons, who I know quite well. And, it's a powerful thing. So I'm going to put this in the chat. Let's see if I can do it to everyone. Can I do everyone, or I only get to do hosts and panelists? I think I only get to
You
do
should
hosts
be
and
able to
panelists.
do everyone.
Yeah, the
Sorry,
chat
but
is
it's an
open to
echo.
everybody.
You should be able to do everyone, but if not, we can move it to everyone once you put it in.
I'm gonna put it in hosts and panelists, and then you can put it in everyone.
Yeah.
And so
sounds
this
good.
is, fortunately, C-SPAN has recorded it. And this is the oral argument in that case, and I want to say 2004 or 2005. You see it? It should be in the chat. The link to the C-SPAN, Christine's got it. Okay. So yeah, lawyers have been working on it, have been trying without success. We have something called the statute of limitations, which is a period of time in which you can bring a claim. I mean, and I think it's important that people know, and not just lawyers, the idea that people sat around, and sometime in the 1970s said, hey, it would be great if we got reparations. Read Mary Frances Berry's book, My Face is Black is True,
Right.
about Callie House, who started the ex-slaves pension movement. This was in the 1890s, where,
Right.
she started a movement. She was a laundress trying to get pensions for elderly, formerly enslaved people who could no longer work. And really their focus was incredibly modest. It was to provide subsistence for those people, but mostly to also provide some kind of burial insurance so people could bury their dead. That was in the 1890s. And she was arrested then for mail fraud and imprisoned. I mean, so, we've been at this a long time as a people.
All right. I think we've only got time for about one more question, maybe.
Just one. I'm
or
losing my voice.
Tracy asked, how have you processed the trauma of looking at all the photos of lynching and studying the case files for this book?
Question.
Tracy, that's such an interesting question. When I was writing the book, people would ask me that question, and I would say, to be honest, I'm not traumatized. That, reading about what people went through, I feel so much for them. My life is not what their lives were. And therefore, I don't feel like I have the right to. I also, as a civil rights lawyer, have always said I never want to make myself the story, that it's about my clients. But then at some point, I think I did feel depressed. and I realized I thought it wasn't affecting me, but it was affecting me, So I think that, if you're a sentient person, if you love your people as I do, you can't help but feel there's nothing wrong with that, and that it is to be expected. And it's a process that you have to go through. Fortunately, I had tools at my disposal to honor them, which is to tell their story and to make sure that they're not forgotten, and to know that, to make sure that people know that, George Armwood wasn't just a drifter. He was a human being, who's, and he had a family who loved him, when you look on his death certificate, it's just a line drawn through his next of kin. That's why finding that picture of his mother and his sister was so important. His mother, who basically apprenticed him to a white family because it was in the midst of the Depression. And they said, they could, feed him and take care of him. So that's the way that, to me, that was the therapy is in, and always has been, in representing my clients, is just, I'm so proud to be able to represent them. And I feel so privileged to be able to do it. And the more I demand attention to their humanity, and the more I am fighting for the full first-class citizenship of Black people, that kind of takes away, feelings of depression. It actually feels like I'm empowered to do something on their behalf, and I feel trusted by them to do it, which is also a really extraordinary feeling.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This evening has been just wonderful. Thank you, Sherilyn. Thank you, Evelyn, for another very inspiring, very interesting reading room in the social justice space, and for delivering the message to all who participated, from those who have joined with you in this type of research to those who are just learning and just growing in this area and want to know what they can do and how they can learn more. Evelyn, would you like to provide any closeout remarks?
Well, I just want to thank you, Sherilyn Ifill, for not only what you've written about, but what you've been doing, ever since you started school. And, you've had a commitment to making the world better, making the lives of Black people better. I mean, you are our shining star. We are really, really proud of you. I've
Thank
told you
you.
this before,
Thank
but
you.
I really am inspired every time I listen to you. And I'm just glad that I had a chance to share you with all these people in the Asala reading room.
I'm really truly honored. I'm going to finish my membership later tonight so I can be a part of you. And just, we're just in really perilous times, and we have to just link arms and believe in our own strength and keep fighting. At the end of the day, America's not going to survive unless we deal with the things that make us weak. And this is right at the center. So I feel like we've been proven right, and we have to continue doing the work. Don't give up.
And of course, thank you to all of our participants. This was a really popular one tonight. We had hundreds and hundreds of people sign up, come on board, actively participate. So the message was loud and strong. Thank you to all. And of course, thank you to Howard University and the Mellon Foundation for bringing the resources to Asala to let these programs happen. And with your membership at asala.org, we will be able to continue these kind of programs in the years and months to come. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night and a wonderful holiday season.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Jerry makes a call left early.